Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about how to find meaning in suffering. Now, suffering is something that nowadays has gotten rather interesting to discuss. Give a little idea, as we do with every podcast, of what I'm talking about before I start making an argument one way or another. Well, let's talk about first what suffering is and what it isn't. First off, it is not discomfort. It is not when you feel uncomfortable with something. I have this dialogue with my toddler daughter every once in a while, and by dialogue, it's not a real one. She's a toddler. But if she doesn't want to eat something and she throws a fit, I say, you're not dying, you're just uncomfortable. I think a lot of people could use that advice for their own lives, that sometimes the things that we go through that are uncomfortable are just that. They're uncomfortable. We're not suffering for them. Suffering is also not discontent. Just because you don't feel happy or fulfilled by something, it doesn't mean you're suffering. Suffering is the inability to change something that continually and negatively impacts your functioning. I mean, functioning in a physical and an emotional sense here. Suffering isn't something that just comes and goes. It's this pervasive feeling or experience that happens over time. One thing that I will say about suffering is it's required for personal growth and this magical word called character. If you want to have a sense of character in your life, you want to grow and be a better person, you have to embrace suffering in a positive way. This doesn't mean you're thrilled about suffering. It doesn't mean that you would even prefer it or choose it, but what it does mean is that you have to accept suffering and the things that come with it if you want to become a better person. So what do I mean by suffering? What is suffering anyway? Well, we can suffer in a few different ways through health. We can suffer in relationships through our identity or our sense of belonging. Often physical issues cause suffering for people. If you have long-term or chronic pain to a significant degree, that is a sense of suffering. If there are broken relationships that have been out of your control in ways that you've been manipulated or hurt, I would call that suffering. If there is a part of you that is incongruent with the way that you are living your life and it seems unachievable, that can be categorized as suffering, as well as being ostracized, a way that you do not belong to a group of people. That sense of isolation can also bring suffering. Here's why suffering is so important outside of personal growth, why it's so important to talk about and address today. We live in a culture that strives for the absence of suffering. The technical philosophical term for this is hedonism, which is the chasing of pleasure with the avoidance of suffering. Now, if you've done any sort of philosophical research on your own, or maybe you've heard some of this, hedonism can be thrown out as just this chasing of pleasure. Often, one of the things that I hear about hedonism is it's a treadmill. And the treadmill of hedonism is you seek pleasure, and then when it's no longer pleasurable, you have to up the ante. You have to push it a little further. But I want to talk about the other side of hedonism, the absence or the push away of suffering. In today's culture, we have medications, we have treatments, we have whole social movements that push away from the idea of suffering. If you feel badly about yourself, there is a treatment for that. If you feel lost and alone, well, there's a treatment for that. If you feel like you don't fit in, that's because everyone else is wrong. We have engaged in an idea. This idea is that no one should suffer, no matter what. Even if their suffering is their fault, they shouldn't experience it. I'm going to go out on a little limb here. I've heard many, many times that housing is a human right. No one should suffer like that. And I wholeheartedly disagree. If you refuse to work, you refuse to do anything, you're not physically or truly mentally disabled, and you just refuse to do anything, you should be homeless. That is not suffering. You placed that upon yourself. That is not what I mean by suffering well. That's just being a petulant child. Suffering is something that is usually done without your control. People can be born with genetic deformities. That is a sense of suffering. If you have, let's say, harmed your body over decades through drinking, and now you have liver issues, I'm not sure that I can call that suffering because you placed it upon yourself. Even in addiction itself, if you've listened to earlier episodes, I don't believe is a disease. So you can't glorify the suffering of an addiction because it's not something you were born with. It's something you take on and has built up over years. If you're curious about how that works, my book, To Those Left Behind, it'll be in the show notes, explains how that develops. But suffering itself isn't just something we take on. We also don't truly suffer just for the sake of it. Now, this might be on my mind a little more, just because at the time of recording this episode, there's a whole bunch of student protests going on campuses, which has been incredibly baffling. Because one of the things that has been really confusing for someone who looks at social psychology and how people function is how many very highly privileged students, I mean privileged in the true way, not in the social justice Marxism way, but truly privileged students place themselves in situations where they lack these amenities that they've been used to. And then they make a list of requirements. And when those don't get met, they call that suffering. That's not suffering. You placed yourself there. You caused this problem. So the student protests that are concerned about food or water or shelter, you can walk away. You can get up and leave. That's not suffering. That's performance. You gain nothing from that. Some country on the other side of the world doesn't really care that you're sitting on your college campus lawn protesting. They don't. They might feed into it because it's interesting and it might gain them social influence, but you're not doing anything. You're placing yourself in the midst of suffering, hoping to gain social capital. But in the end, you could walk away. You gain nothing, and you somehow call it suffering and want some sort of benefit from it. It's not how this works. Many popular modern movements enact fake suffering because we live in a society here in the United States that is so overwhelmingly luxurious that we have no idea how to suffer well. I've recommended to many people, and I think I've done it on this podcast already, that if you feel as if you're suffering here in the US, as if things are so overwhelming that you don't know how to handle it, I would encourage you to go to a third world country and be a part of an organization, even if it's for a week, that serves those who are truly suffering. When you're not a part of the exorbitant luxury that we have here in the United States, you start to understand what real suffering is. It is not feeling sad because you didn't get enough attention. That is not suffering. I will remember until the day I die or Alzheimer's takes over that I spent some time in Honduras for a service project. And I watched kids walk out of a trash pile, thrilled, smiling, because we were handing them bags of food supplies. You might be asking, why were they in trash heaps? Because that's where they usually got food. The food that was thrown away because there wasn't a social welfare system, you got what you could get. You know what those kids did? They smiled and said thank you. In the midst of overwhelming suffering, a lack of parents in their lives, this inability to meet basic needs, they were thankful. And what we experience today, this entitled sense of being right or feeling fulfilled, is not suffering. It's the whining of a child. So I've taken some things down a few pegs, and you'll have to forgive me as the listener. I'm watching a whole lot of these things play out in front of me, and I see so many college students and adults play act suffering, and it's some huge performance art that is going on that lacks any real depth. But what does suffering actually mean? How do we do it well? Suffering well includes a sense of purpose, where it is that you're going, what it is you're doing with your life. A lot of times, suffering well includes the benefit of someone else. Am I suffering for the benefit of someone I love? Am I working through this for the ability to share something with my children? Am I, for instance, some of what I've been doing recently, working on a dissertation and spending hours and hours and hours a week and sometimes extra hours in the day to try to finish something so that my children will never remember me doing it? Yes, I've placed that on myself. I wouldn't necessarily call that suffering, but the concept of sacrificing for someone else, that can lead to suffering well. Suffering well doesn't just have to include other people. It can also engage in reliance on others and teaching about what charity and what love truly is. For health problems, as I talked about earlier, suffering well includes accepting what you've had. Obviously, if you can do something about your health issues, do it. But if you can't, learning the love and connection that is in relationship, that this world sucks sometimes, and not everybody makes it through with a whole body or with a whole mind that doesn't hate them. In relationships, sometimes we can suffer because those that we love make poor decisions. And in that, you might ask, well, how do I suffer well in terrible relationships? If you can sit through it and you can mourn and you can weep, you understand the value of relationships. And it isn't that you will pick it better, but you understand the foundation of what it means to be loved. If you come out on the other side not bitter, you can be a light and a beacon to other people in relationships. It isn't just telling them what to do and what not to do, but showing them that there's purpose in it. For suffering and a sense of identity, that's something that I think has unnecessarily become relevant nowadays. Identity is one of the big words, one of the driving forces of a lot of things that are happening, at least here in the US. But suffering and identity is when you feel that something is going on inside of you that doesn't match what the world is experiencing of you. Now, sometimes that suffering and identity is justified. Sometimes it's the outside world conflicting with who you are as a person. Sometimes that conflict is due to mental health issues. For instance, let's say you have a personal religious belief that is persecuted from the outside. I could consider that suffering and identity. But let's take one of the more common and controversial issues nowadays, where your gender identity doesn't match your physical body. You can't fix that. You can't make them align. With the belief in the outside world, chances are you're not going to change minds. Learning to accept who you are and what the truth is could lead to suffering well and the prevention of later issues. You can become insulated, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second. The last thing, suffering in belonging. When you feel distant from others, you feel alone, it can be very easy to slip into despair. But those that are able to see the purpose and the hope and disconnection find value in the small things. They can see where a kind conversation can go a long way, and they can become more aware of others that are suffering. When someone struggles with their own sense of belonging, when they suffer being alone, if they're able to do it well, they can find others like them. They can create a sense of purpose in being together. So this suffering that I'm talking about today, you don't put it on yourself. You don't wear it as a costume. It's something you sit through. But how do we suffer well? Well, one, you do it in peace. You don't do it with a big group of people. It's not suffering. That's performance art. And even people who are genuinely suffering, when they make it a big ordeal, they're not suffering well. A lot of times nowadays, they're monetizing their suffering, which makes me wonder if they're gaining anything at all except a little bit of ad revenue. True suffering and suffering well is accepting what reality is and where you're at. It's not saying that it's right. It's not saying that you would condone it or want it with anyone else, but it's accepting the world for how it is. But sometimes it's dark and bleak and people don't get better. It's finding meaning. It's understanding pain from the perspective of purpose and seeing that hope can be found in humanity and in relationships, even if you don't see it yet. It's working in tilling the ground. For those that cannot make a sense of direction, it's working so hard that others might benefit from it. I heard a quote that goes along with some of this, and I think it might be useful to put in here, and the purpose of suffering and why we as people should sit through things, to accept them for how they are and find meaning and purpose in it. It's from J.R.R. Tolkien in his book, The Lord of the Rings. And it comes from a character named Gandalf. And if you're not aware, Gandalf is the sage character, the one who provides guidance and direction and is very philosophical. But I'm going to read this out, and it can give us an idea of a sense of suffering well. It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. I've really fallen in love with this quote because it talks about us doing what we can for those that come after. Why have I learned to suffer in mental health well? It's not just so that I can find meaning, but that I can provide a land for my daughter, that I can find a sense of meaning and purpose that I can share with others, so that my wife and the children that we raise, that we can show them that there is truth and hope in a world that doesn't make sense sometimes. Suffering well creates a character that insulates you from future concern. When I've learned to suffer well in my own life, it's protected me against terrible things that happen. Not that I've become numb, but that I've gained strength, and the things that would have overtaken me before no longer do. Maybe that's one of the greatest lessons in this episode is learn to suffer now so that when trials come later, they won't overtake you. For those that never learn to suffer well in childhood when you're told no, in early adulthood when you're rejected, they're doomed to repeat this cycle because life includes suffering. There's no one that gets out of this life without suffering. And therapy shouldn't be a way that you avoid suffering. It should be a way that you understand and embrace it in a positive way. So I work with my clients that sometimes life sucks and you cannot make it better, but you can sit in it and address it, be present. And for anyone listening today who is wondering what they should do in their own lives, how they should embrace positive suffering, take a look at what you're dealing with. Are the things that you struggle with, are they placed upon yourself? Did you cause these issues? Maybe you suffer in some way, but if you're causing your own issues, that's not suffering in a positive way. Those are consequences. But if there are things that are outside of your control, if there are things that you truly struggle with, learn to do it well. Not perfectly, but learn to do it well. To calm yourself and deal with what you can. Accept the things that you cannot change. Act on the things you can. I hope from today that you've understood what suffering is. It's a way for you to embrace the present so that the future may be more worthwhile, that you can gain a greater sense of meaning, that you're not tied down to just your ability to feel good and to enjoy certain things, but that life can be fulfilling and you can be content, even when the world around you, or maybe the world inside of you, is chaotic. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got something that is useful for you. Suffering is a heavy topic, and it's not one that I really take lightly, but it's one that has to be spoken about. If you found this podcast useful, I hope you follow the show. You share it with other people so that they can gain something as well. Also, if you feel the need to support this podcast, you can leave a tip. There will be a link in the notes section so that I can pay for the production of this podcast. Thanks and have a great day.